Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for day 2. This is day 2 of our 2025 virtual horse management seminar. So we're focusing on nutrition today, and we've got a couple of great speakers, and I'm really excited about their talks. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Carrie Williams. For those of you who haven't been to any of my programs or know me, I've been the equine extension specialist at Rutgers University for about 22 years now. This is our fourth virtual horse management seminar. We actually in 2020, we managed to have our live horse management seminar just before COVID hit. But since 2021, we've been running a virtual series. And that is due to, well, it started with COVID, but we've had such huge numbers with our virtual series that and a lot of people have said, no, please keep them coming, that we decided to keep them virtual as well. So thank you from across the country and the world for joining us today. I will say, if you've missed any of our seminars previously, whether it was all the way back in 2021 or even just last Tuesday, we do have them being recorded and they will be posted. All of the previous ones are posted up until this year. This year's seminars, we're going to wait until we're all done, and probably around maybe the first or second week of March, we are going to post them in the same location, and that is on our Equine Science Center YouTube page. So you can just Google the Equine Science Center YouTube page, or maybe, and I'm springing this on Kyle, maybe eventually he can pull up the link for you and stick it in the chat in case you're interested in hearing some of our previous horse management seminar series. So with that being said, that was a little introduction of myself in the series, but the next thing I want to do is give a little bit of housekeeping. So first off, the chat box. That is only available to panelists and to hosts like myself and Kyle, who's the behind the scenes man who's helping me with all of the registration, all of the tech issues and things like that. So if you're having problems with anything tech related, please just type in the chat and Kyle is going to help you out. However, for questions, please don't put your questions in the chat tonight. We will not be monitoring the chat box for questions. We're going to be using the Q&A box. So if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a couple buttons, and one of them has a little box with a question mark in it. That is Q&A. So if you have any questions for our speakers along the way, please use that Q&A box. And I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A box, and I'm going to be deciding which ones we're going to ask live when the speaker is done. Hopefully we'll be able to get through all of them, but if we can't, I have asked the speakers to kind of, help monitor them, and maybe Dr. Ivey can stay a little bit later after her talk, and we can try to get through all the questions. So with that being said, I wanted to learn a little bit about you and about everybody here. So I'm going to pull up my slideshow again, and I'm going to ask everybody to go onto wherever their phones or some other device and go to menti.com. That's MENTI.com. And I'm going to get a little demographic information from everybody here. So if you see the screen as well, menti.com, you're going to see something that says a bunch of numbers, and Kyle's also going to put this in the chat for everybody. If you can go put in the code 95459540, it is going to take you to a little quiz. It's not really a quiz, it's just asking you where you're from. So I see a bunch of people are already starting to join in. So it's important that you don't abbreviate your state, because as you see, some of the words are bigger than others. Everybody who types in New Jersey is going to get counted, and that word's going to get bigger. But if you put in NJ, it's not going to get counted. So I'd love to know what state you're listening from. Or if you're not within the United States, I'd love to hear what country you're in. So either your state or your country. So I would love to have you add in. And I see a couple of people answering in the chat. And while that's fine, I'd really love to see how it changes in the word cloud. And I always keep track of the word clouds as they change, and we use these for future as well, and for advertising purposes. So right now it does look like Pennsylvania and New Jersey are winning the race, which is about right. That's usually what we have because Rutgers is in New Jersey. But it looks like we've got Michigan, Florida, Maryland, and New York are close behind. Same with South Carolina. You're actually looking quite large there. And yeah, I see, Kelly, you're asking me about the code. So the code was in the chat. So if you look in the chat box, it's 95459540. So it's 95459540. And we have about 95 people in the Mentee area now. So thank you. So as that's starting to slow down and we start to have fewer and fewer responses, I'm going to go. Let me just actually, before it moves, let's see if we have any out of the country. We do. I see Philippines. Welcome, Philippines. Thank you for joining us. It's hard to see when they're moved. Quebec. So we've got some Canadians. Thank you again for joining us. That's all I see right now. But if you are from another country and just haven't logged on to Mentee yet, welcome. Thank you for joining us, as well as all the other states that are listed here. So thank you. So I have one more question for you. I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is going to ask you what your primary action or what your primary interaction is with horses. So I just want to know a little bit about what you guys do. So if you're a horse owner, but also give lessons, you can pick both. I think I have up to 3 choices. Or if you're a veterinarian, but also own a horse. So you can pick up to 3, but try to think, if you have more than 3, just pick your 3 primary things. Because I know the reason why you're here is because you are a horse enthusiast, but if you don't own a horse, I think that would be one of your choices. So it looks like we definitely have a lot of horse owners and enthusiasts. Great. Some lesson and trainers, some barn managers, a few other industry professionals. So great, whether it's tech or feed or pharma. A couple of veterinarians, and then other. So do me a favor, now you can type in the chat. I'd love to know what other is. So what are some of your other occupations? I know sometimes we get, oh, yep, and I see a PATH therapeutic riding instructor. So welcome. And I keep meaning to add you on as a category because we always seem to have quite a few PATH instructors. So thank you. Yeah, more therapeutic riding. Great. Agala. Boarding, you board horses, great, awesome. 4-H program, awesome, welcome 4-H. And a mom, a horse mom, gotta love the horse mom. So thank you very much for joining us. So looks like a really nice distribution of horse activities. So thank you all for chiming in. I really appreciate that. That's always fun to share and fun to take snapshots. I always take a screenshot of both this one as well as our word cloud here, which I'm going to look at that one more time before we continue. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for that. So with that being said, I've done everything I need to do other than introduce our first speaker. So let's get moving. I'm going to ask Dr. Ivey to pop on her camera and to share her slides. I'm really excited to welcome, I would say welcome back, but she's not actually technically in or at Rutgers. She's at home, in her home in Tennessee. But Dr. Jennie Ivey did hold her bachelor's degree and is from New Jersey and went to Rutgers. So it's really nice to see her back on camera. She also has her master's and her PhD from West Virginia University in animal physiology. She has a focus in equine exercise physiology and nutrition. Is currently also pursuing a master's in strategic and digital communications. How much fun. I didn't know that. Dr. Ivey joined the University of Tennessee Institute of Agricultural Faculty in 2015. She has a 95% extension appointment and 5% teaching. She is nationally recognized for her equine extension programs and is supported by about $750,000 in grants and support for her programs. She serves on a lot of committees through the Equine Science Society and at her university, and does a lot with 4-H Roundup and hippology as well. So with that being said, I want to thank Dr. Ivey for joining us, and I am going to go ahead and take myself off camera and let you go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And like you said, it's great to be back, even in virtual form. And so I'm really excited to be here with all of you and to be able to share a little bit about nutrition fundamentals and basic nutrition to help build upon, I think, what looks like to be a great set of speakers and lineups that you have with Dr. Macon this evening after me, and then also next week. So we have a lot to get through tonight, and I'm going to try my best to kind of roll right through. But normally here in Tennessee, I usually say that if I talk too fast or I talk with my hands, I apologize, but I am from New Jersey. And so for those of you that are up there, do me a favor and eat a pork roll, egg, and cheese and have some pizza for me, because darn do I miss it. But without further ado, let's roll right through some basic nutrition. I do want to share some of the students that I have that really work tirelessly behind the scenes to help create some of the data that we're going to talk about tonight, and also all of the people that kind of work behind the scenes to make programs like this possible, right? And each of us, no matter whether it's this talk or talks that you might hear in the future, there are people that have done the work behind the scenes, and I think they really deserve the credit for the hard work that they do. And so Delaney Rosted right here, Olivia Watson, and Sawyer Main were three of my more recent graduate students, and one that's not in here, Ashley Self, but they created a lot of the work that we'll talk about, and they're all in their respective positions within the industry currently. Madeline Parr, who's here in the yellow hat, she's my current graduate student, and Amy Berger's over here. She's one of our county extension agents. And so really throughout this, you'll hear me reference a lot people that are your team and your network, and ways that you can continue to learn about nutrition or any other equine topic that you're interested in. And so really looking for those people that have degrees in the areas that you seek or have some training and also some credentials, and the power of extension is really important. And so I'm really proud of all the work that they do and wanted to share them with you a little bit. And so like Dr. Williams mentioned, we have a really unique program here in Tennessee. We typically float about 10th or so in the nation with regards to our overall equid population, but we're fairly high in donkeys and mules. And so I really believe in the power of education and the importance of exposure and meeting the need of our clientele. And so I just kind of wanted to share with you this little bit of work that we've been doing to try to create more teaching skeletons for our programs, for our extension agents, and for other universities. And so this was a composting project that we did, and these are my two kids because sometimes they get brought to. And so it's been really neat to be able to share that with them, along with this group of USDA faculty that were here on an exchange program. And so this is one of those big moments for me that was like, man, I love the work that I do, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here tonight to share this talk with you, but also to be able to do the job that I do. And so we are going to jump right in, and I've got kind of a variety of key things that I want to share with you to help you hopefully make informed nutrition decisions, no matter what type of equid you're feeding. But from my perspective, and I think a lot of other nutritionists, it's really important that we start with how the horse's digestive system is set up, so we know why we're making some of the nutrition decisions that we are. And so without knowing where the horse and how the horse is digesting, it's difficult to be able to make those strategic decisions. So very quickly and very primitively, right, this is a diagram of the horse's GI tract. And we think about the horse really as a foregut and a hindgut when we think about the actions and the things that are happening. And the foregut being the mouth, okay, down this blue esophagus into the stomach, which is going to have two portions, right, a squamous portion and a glandular portion. And that's important when we think about ulcers and other components as well. And then a small intestine, which is shown here in green, that's broken up into three segments, a duodenum, a jejunum, and an ileum. And they each have different functions as the digesta moves through those three different segments. Then we switch into the hindgut, which is comprised of the cecum, which is this big kind of reddish orange color here. It moves through the colon and then eventually out the rectum. And so we're going to talk very quickly about each of those segments and what they mean and what they do and why we need to think about them when we choose different nutritional programs. So as a quick summary, right, we talked about the different portions on the previous slide, but horses' teeth continually erupt throughout their entire lifetime. And so having a good chewing surface is very important because we could put the best plane of nutrition out in front of your horse, but if they can't chew it, it doesn't really do very much. And so having your horse regularly assessed by your veterinarian or a veterinarian who also does dental work is very important. Okay. The third bullet on here is that remember that horses only produce saliva when they're actively chewing. So that jaw has to move back and forth side to side. Okay. There's one caveat here that, if there's maybe something lodged or stuck in the horse's mouth, they might salivate as well, but we wouldn't consider that to be normal. And the important part about this is that different feed types may produce more or less saliva depending on how much they are chewed. So this is where we might see incidences of things like choke, which is where food gets lodged in the esophagus with certain types of feed products. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. So now as we move through the horse's stomach, right, that stomach is about 2 to 4 gallons large. And again, has those two different components, the glandular and the squamous component, and can be prone to ulcers if we don't have an adequate amount of forage or feed in the stomach to be able to help buffer that acid and provide a good forage mat that helps to prevent acid from splashing up into that squamous portion or the upper portion, okay? Then as we move into the small intestine, this is where the horse should ideally digest all of the protein, fat, and simple carbohydrates or sugars within any type of feed. So whether this is a forage or a concentrate or some type of supplement, all of that really should be happening and being absorbed in that section for the horse to get the most benefit from those different nutrients. Okay. And then when we talk about the foregut, we'll talk about what happens when some of that spills over into the fermentation vat or the cecum. Okay. Another really important thing to remember is that horses have a very strong gastroesophageal sphincter. Okay. And if we break that word down, gastro meaning stomach, okay, esophageal meaning esophagus. So the junction of those two pieces of the anatomy has a very strong muscular sphincter that prevents the horse from being able to formally burp or belch or vomit. Okay. So if you've ever heard a horse burp, it's probably because there's been some air stuck in their esophagus. But once things make it into the stomach, that's where they stay and they have to pass through the rest of the digestive tract. Okay. So the horse's GI tract in total is about 100 feet long. Okay. For about the average 1,000-pound horse. So from the mouth all the way to the end of the small intestine is typically around 75 to 80 feet. Okay, that's a lot of distance that gets covered in less than about 4 hours, right? So all of these things and all of these portions of digestion happen very quickly in the foregut. Then we move to the hindgut. But very quickly, I want to show you something about point number 2, right? The teeth continually erupting. So it's really important, like I said, that you visit with a veterinarian or someone that can really get in and take a good look at that chewing surface. So this was a horse that we had on one of our research trials. The horse was a little bit emaciated, which has been the focus of a lot of our work lately. And as we stabilized this horse and went to perform a dental, okay, he had a very slight overbite or a parrot mouth, which is where the upper arcade or the upper jaw is set forward to the point that these teeth back here and even the incisors don't have an occlusal surface or a chewing surface to rub against. So as those teeth continually kept growing, these points, okay, had nothing to wear against. So as you could imagine, the lower jaw where these teeth were pointing into was really painful. And so the owner, for a variety of reasons, was unable to afford veterinary care, but had been providing her horse with an adequate forage and was struggling to understand why he wasn't eating very well. Okay, and this is a pretty good indicator as to what was going on. Okay. Similarly, we see a lot of horses that are older or maybe are cribbers or have other conditions where they just might not have great teeth, right? So we saw a horse, this is not specifically that horse, but a very similar case recently where the owners were just struggling because they had the most beautiful pastures, one of the prettiest they've ever seen, appropriate grazing management, and the horse was really struggling because he had dentition that looked very similar to this, and he couldn't go around and graze appropriately. Okay, so teeth are really important, and it's okay to look at them and be able to understand and ask those questions about how we can manage the dentition better. Okay, so now we're going to shift to the hindgut. And so in that hindgut, right, it is comprised of the cecum, the large colon, the small colon, and the rectum. And there's a very specific pathway, just like other portions of the digesta, but specifically in the hindgut, where you or your veterinarian might listen for gut sounds to be able to help indicate if there's some type of impaction, if you have a horse that's colicking. And that's because of the way the anatomy lays within the horse's abdomen. Conversely, compared to the fairly small capacity that we saw within the foregut, okay, the hindgut has a pretty large capacity. That cecum is about 30 gallons, and the colon holds about 80 gallons in total, or I'm sorry, 80 liters, excuse me, in total, okay? And what's happening back here is that we see pretty much all of the water reabsorption from the digesta to keep the body hydrated. There's also vitamin B, K, and C synthesis by the microbiome in the cecum. So as those little bacteria are fermenting the fiber components within the horse's diet, they're also producing really positive products aside from energy, like vitamins B, K, and C. Okay. And so really what's happening back here is that the horse's cecum and all of the microbes that are present within and other components that make up that fluid, very similar to a rumen in a cow or a sheep, they're producing volatile fatty acids or energy through that fermentation process. And that's where we see the majority of the horse's energy come from in the diet. And we'll talk about feeding forage and its importance in just a few minutes. And so, really, as we think about all of those components, okay, we have teeth that are continually erupting, we have a fast passage rate, the need to digest fat, simple carbohydrates, and protein in the foregut, then we're fermenting that fiber in the hindgut. It leads us to ask the question, well, how much of all of these nutrients does the animal actually require? Okay. And that's a great question. There's some things that you can do at home, and I got to see kind of the poll of where each of you are within your connection to the industry. But these are some strategies that you can take home to help you better understand what your animals might need, okay, and how that might shift depending on their status of production, their weight, and their body condition. I do want to make a mention that if any of you are managing donkeys and mules, there are some adjustments that we can make to make sure that we're not overfeeding those animals that are a little bit more metabolically efficient. So specifically with our donkeys, right, they require a little bit less energy and a little less quality protein and quantity of protein than a horse of a similar size. So that's an important distinction to remember as we go through. Okay. So what do we need to think about with regard to these nutrient requirements? And so you'll hear me mention and reference primary requirements and secondary requirements. Okay, and really what that breaks down to is that primary requirements are the nutrients needed for maintenance or the animal to sustain itself in its current state. So say, for example, if I had a horse that was fairly overweight, right? The amount of nutrients that I would need to sustain its body weight the way it is currently would be its primary or maintenance requirements. Okay. Now, notice I didn't say I would like the horse to lose weight because that falls into our secondary requirements. Okay, so things that are needed for the animal to walk around, to eat, to graze, to have its heart function, its lungs to work, its kidneys to work, all of those roll into maintenance requirements or primary requirements. Now, if we think about secondary requirements, okay, they are the components that we need to consider based upon maybe the animal's exercise or workload, their production status. So are they growing? Are they reproducing? Are they lactating? And then any type of maybe disease or other consideration. So things like weight gain or weight loss. Right, I mentioned previously that my current research area looks at emaciated horses and recovering them back to a healthy body condition. And so if we were to balance a ration for that animal, we would first work on their maintenance or their primary requirements. which is where the animal currently stands today, and then make adjustments to help that animal gain weight, which would be part of their secondary requirement. Okay, there may be others, and I know we're going to talk about one of them later tonight with Dr. Macon. Okay, she's going to share more about metabolic conditions, but things like that, things like HYPP, right? Hyperkalemic periodic paralysis, which affects how much potassium is needed in the diet. We might also look at maybe Keeves, okay, or chronic inflammation in the airway that changes the animal's energy needs. So there's lots of different things that can manipulate or change how we might need to look at what the animal requires. But it really all comes down to taking into consideration those primary and secondary requirements, and also the body weight calculation. So this is really important because it is what dictates to us how much energy, right, the animal might need at maintenance, and maybe how much more it might need in its third trimester of pregnancy. Okay. And so we think about the horse's diet, again, somewhat primitively here, just due to time, in these four major sections. Okay, so energy coming from carbohydrates, or abbreviated here as CHO, and fats. And that's where the majority of the energy in the diet should come from. And this may come from fibrous or complex carbohydrates, and a little bit from those simple carbohydrates or sugars as well. Okay. Then we think about protein. So we want to consider protein in the horse's diet, both on a quantity, right? How much protein the animal needs, but also on protein quality, which means, are we feeding the horse a good source of protein that contains all of the essential amino acids that the diet and that the animal will require? Or is it really kind of a poorer quality protein? Right, and we can think of this in an example of barrel staves, right? So if I had a barrel and it has all the different staves around it, and I cut one of those staves really low, the ability to hold water in that barrel is limited by the height of that shortest stave. And so if we think about it, that barrel being a protein, the amino acids are all of those little barrel staves. And so the horse has different requirements for each amino acid that it requires within the diet, and then some that it can make within its own body based upon how we feed. There are a variety of different minerals that your horse requires as well. Some in larger quantities are what we would consider macro minerals, things like sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, and phosphorus. And microminerals, things that are needed in smaller amounts, but still very important, things like copper and iron and manganese and things like that. And then obviously vitamins. We mentioned that previously, the fat-soluble vitamins being A, D, E, and K, and the water-soluble vitamins being B, K, and C. And so there's a whole lot of different ways, and we can spend weeks talking just about these components, but we don't have enough time to do that this evening. But what is important is the understanding that body weight is how we do those mathematical calculations. But there's a lot of things happening in the horse's body, or even in your body, that also are important for us to understand nutritional status. So what that means is that we're going to talk about body weight and how you can assess that at home. But there's also something called body condition. Okay, and that's how fat is laid down across the horse's body in specific areas, which can give us an indication of their overall nutritional status. Okay, but we've learned through work done by other scientists, including some at Rutgers, about how we understand how nutrition influences muscle condition. Okay, and there's a separate system that you can utilize to assess your animal's muscle condition, and also something called a cresty neck score, which helps us to assess how much fat cover is in that neck crest area and its connection potentially to insulin sensitivity. Okay, so for today's portion, we're going to focus mostly on body weight and body condition. Okay, and that's important for a few reasons. And so in your mind, really quickly, I want you guys to picture a horse that's 900 pounds. Okay, so hopefully you have maybe a horse that's popped up, or one maybe that you've owned that might have been close to that weight. And so if I just give you a body weight, right, that might give you a specific image. But what if I told you that that 900-pound Equid was actually like a 12-hand pony? Okay, hopefully in your mind now you're picturing a very obese pony who probably needs some nutritional intervention, right? But on the flip side, what if I told you that that was a 900-pound mature draft horse? okay, that changes your perception and the way that now we're picturing a horse that's much thinner. So this is where body weight is important because we have to do those calculations to get our nutritional value. But understanding the overall nutritional status of the animal is also very important. And that's where body condition score comes into play. So when we think about how you can estimate body weight at home, there are a few ways that maybe you guys have tried or maybe have worked on throughout the course of your equine ownership. And usually it's typically a combination of these two. So some people will say, you know what, I can just visually estimate how much my horse weighs. And some of you may have used a weight tape or one that you might be able to find at your local feed or tack store that helps you understand and estimate around the horse's heart girth what they could weigh. Okay, and there are some that are a little more accurate than others that have hit the market. But more recent research has indicated that really taking body measurements, okay, and I'll show you that on the next slide, or what we would call morphometric measurements, is actually a better indicator of overall body weight, potentially than the first two. Research also tells us that most horse owners, if we're using visual estimations, tend to over or underestimate their horse's body weight by at least 300 pounds. So that's a big scale, okay, if we're really off in the way that we're viewing our horse or even other people's horses. And obviously, the gold standard would be that you have a scale or access to a scale that you can weigh your horse on. I see a lot of owners down here load their horses up in the trailer and they'll drive across some truck scales and then go home, drop the horse off, and come right back across those scales to see the difference. And they'll get a somewhat accurate weight from that perspective. But overall, we see that the least accurate being the visual estimate and the most accurate being the scale. So how you can do this at home, I usually just get like a soft, like a sewing tape measure or something like that. Make sure it's long enough, okay, that you can go to all of these measurements. But this is what you would need to take. So in white, we have a measurement for body length. Ooh, goodness. From the point of the shoulder, okay, all the way back to the point of the rump. And you would measure that in centimeters. We then are going to take a girth, a heart girth circumference, and I apologize, this looks like it's just straight, but the heart girth circumference is going to come all the way around your horse's heart girth, right at the wither, right where the neck meets the back. Then we want to take a neck circumference, again, all the way around the horse's neck, at the midpoint of the neck. Okay, so that's where the pink line here, from the pole to the wither, gives you neck length. We take that in half, and we're going to measure the horse's neck circumference at half of the neck length. Again, when that neck is in a neutral position. So even if you're not into math, okay, you could just take these four measurements. This was done by work out of Minnesota by Dr. Martinson and her colleagues, and calculate with a little bit more accuracy, okay, your horse's body weight. Now, again, if you are somewhat removed from algebra, okay, this is not as scary as it looks, I promise. But I wanted to show you these to give you an understanding of we have various different equations that are more breed specific, right? Because if I think about the body proportions, right, the neck, the body length, maybe the heart girth, things like that, of a juvenile miniature horse, and I compare that to a thoroughbred, right? They may not necessarily look the same. So that single weight tape measurement that just goes around the heart girth might not take into account that my miniature horse has a slightly shorter neck, right? It may not take into effect that draft horses have a much thicker, broader neck. So using these morphometric measurements to estimate current body weight, there's also a set of equations to help you estimate ideal body weight. And they're all available with a little bit more ease in this Healthy Horse app that the Minnesota group developed. So this is just, again, one resource that you can use. Again, you could reach out to your local extension agent or your extension specialist, and they could help you, especially if you know how to take those measurements. Okay, so let's do a little activity. I know this is hard, but really quickly as I'm explaining this to you, I want you guys in the chat to take a guess at how much you think this horse weighs. Okay, he's 17 hands tall to give you an idea. But take a guess. What do you guys think he might weigh? Just looking at him standing there in the stall over at our vet school. All right, so just looking at some of these that have come in, right? I think the biggest one I saw was closer to 1,800 pounds. Some of these guesses are down near 1,000. So we have about an 800-pound range just in the couple hundred of you that are on this talk right now. Okay. But if we look at how the scale and weight tapes checked out, so when we did a weight tape measurement on this horse, he weighed 1,500 pounds. Okay. When we did the morphometric measurements, he weighed 1,277. Right? So just in this area, okay, we see about a 250-pound difference in how these were being assessed, right, or estimated. This horse was in the clinic with us, and so we did weigh him on the scale, and he came out at 1499. All right, which is something that we would expect based upon the current research that's out there, because a lot of the weight tapes were designed for horses that were a body condition, okay, or again, that overall nutritional status of about a 6 to a 7. And so this horse was a little bit heavier than that. I forget what he taped at, but looking at him, I would probably put him closer to an 8. Um, and it just shows that there's a little bit of variety. Okay, so now we're going to go to the other side of this. And I want you guys to do the same. So this mare was 15 hands tall. And what do you think she might weigh? Okay, so you guys are in the maybe the 6 to 8, 9, 1,000. Okay. And that's great, right? We've got a lot of variability in the way we just quickly visually estimate what this horse might look like. Okay. When we did a weight tape on her, she taped at 780 pounds. Okay. When we did our morphometric measurements for her, she did 897, right? So we went the opposite direction as to what we saw from the heavier horse, right? And it's important to understand and remember that these are not perfect systems, right? They're estimates. But especially in our more emaciated horses, or even in older horses that have a lot of muscle atrophy, or maybe horses that have lost some weight for a variety of medical reasons, and we're trying to put that weight back on, these tape and morphometric measurements might overestimate what your horses actually are weighing. And we suspect that that's the case because if we look even at this mare's neck, right, it's got a lot of concave area that when I go to take that measurement, I don't push the tape in, right? I just measure all the way around, but it's still assuming that there's something there. Okay. So this mare's actual weight was 637 pounds. Right. Now, this is really important because, again, and we're going to talk about how we calculate some of these requirements per day. But if I'm calculating that this mare's current body weight is almost 900 pounds and I'm making a diet for her, but her actual weight is only 637 pounds, okay, I'm overfeeding her by almost 270 pounds. Okay, or 170 pounds, excuse me, which is a big difference, especially in horses that might have a very delicate nutritional balance. So this is important, and I'm going to go back here really quickly because this horse might need to go on a diet, right? So if I'm estimating that this horse's weight maybe is 1277, I might overestimate how much I can reduce those calories per day to get to the horse in the right place. So this is where the scale is great. If not, we can utilize these, but just be aware that they're not perfect. Okay. All right, so shifting to body condition score, we assess 6 different areas across the horse's body of predictable fat laydown. And I apologize because this fat pad behind the shoulder, this little half circle should really be more up in this area. But we're going to look at the neck crest, okay, which I saw a comment about when we measure, do we go straight across the horse's neck? And ideally, you would go kind of lay it right across on the top here. But as you go to pull or flex that horse's neck crest, okay, everything above the nuchal ligament or the part that moves is considered the horse's neck crest. Okay, over the wither, behind the shoulder, right across the ribs at the middle portion of the ribs. So we don't want to assess body condition up here towards the loin or down here towards more of the abdominal layer. Right across the back here in the loin area and at the tail head. Okay, and the reason that we assess these different areas is because that's where the horse holds most of its fat. Now, certainly there's fat around the organs and there can be fat in different areas, but we can get a good understanding of the horse's nutritional status by assessing these 6 areas. And we do this on a 1 to 9 scale here in the United States, where 1 to 3 are considered to be the underconditioned horses. 4 to 6 are considered the moderately conditioned horses, and 7 to 9 are considered overconditioned. Okay, and if the term condition is tripping you up, think of it as being under nutrition. Okay, so they're thin, they don't have a lot of fat on them. Moderate being the ones that are kind of right around where we would expect them to be without any negative problems from either direction. And overconditioned mean they've had too much nutrition, right? They have too many calories and too much nutrient, and now they're holding on to it. Okay, and what these scores really relate to, and I apologize if this gets a little bit text heavy, is body fat percentages, right? So if I assess a horse a body condition score of 2, what I'm really saying is that I am estimating that their body fat is between 5 and 10%. Okay, so as I showed you in that first picture of the 17-pound or 17-hand horse, okay, that horse was probably around an 8, so about 35 to 40% body fat. So we would want to maybe reduce that horse's body condition by 2 or 3 even to get them to a more appropriate body condition score. And there are very specific descriptions that go along with each of these different scores. And I'm happy to share them with Dr. Williams to be able to let you guys have some references that you can look at to be able to do this at home. But just due to time, we're going to keep moving. Okay. So now as we transition from physically assessing the animal to now thinking about their nutrition, diet history becomes really important. And we're going to talk about a few of these in the next few minutes. But things like what type of forage are you feeding, right? Are we feeding a type of concentrate? Are there any supplements that your horse is on? And when we ask you those questions, whether it's me or another nutritionist or your veterinarian, we also need a little more information than just the what, but we need the how much, how often, and for how long, right? So ideally, you should be feeding by weight and not by volume. So what we mean by that, and I'm fairly certain that most of the coffee companies would go out of stock if horse owners stopped using their Kansas feed scoops. But the amount of horse owners that call me and say, hey, well, I feed 2 Folgers cans, or I feed a large Maxwell House can of this feed twice a day. If you drink coffee like me, I drink it by like the bucket. So my coffee scoop is going to be much bigger than potentially somebody else's can. So weighing it, right? Because now you might be able to say, hey, I feed my 1 scoop of grain per day, but that weighs about 2 pounds. Okay. And that can get us a much better understanding of the nutrition that's being provided to your horse by knowing the actual weight versus just the volume. And the same goes for forages. So if you're feeding a couple flakes of hay, the setup that we use most often is a hanging luggage or a hanging calf scale and a muck tub. Okay, usually clean, or you could use a hay net too, and just hang it right on that hanging scale. And then you'll have a better idea of how much a forage you're feeding per day. Right? How frequently are we feeding it? The little clock image here to say, are you feeding that only once a day? Do you feed it in smaller meals throughout the course of the day? Are you dropping feed at night? Right? And what does that look like? And then for how long, like I mentioned. So a lot of horse owners we know don't have the ability to store forage within their home or in their barn or even an external facility. And so they're buying it very quickly. And so knowing when you shifted feeds, knowing when you switched bags of concentrate, et cetera, is a really important diagnostic tool that can not only help your veterinarian, but help you determine what's happening nutritionally. So rule number 3, right? Number 1 was know the digestive system. Number 2 was some of those feeding fundamentals and body condition and body weight and nutrient requirements. Now we're moving into the number 1 rule, I think, of feeding, which is feed the forage first. Okay, forage needs to comprise the majority of your horse's nutritional program. And if it doesn't, it's really important to take a step back because it's probably a much more cost-effective way to feed your horse. And something that's really important to make sure that you understand the nutrition that's being provided. Okay, so what do we mean by this? Okay, number one, we want your horse to eat no less than 1% of its body weight on a dry matter basis per day. So, what we mean by that, to break it down, okay, 1% of their body weight. Well, we just talked about how you can estimate your horse's body weight. And so, to make the math simple here, if I had a 1,000-pound horse, I would want them to eat no less than 10 pounds of their body weight on a dry matter basis per day. And so all dry matter means is that if we were to look at all about 200 of you out there tonight, and I looked at each of your different hays that you have in your barn, it would be very difficult to do that on what we call an as fed, or as it's sitting out in your barns in your facilities this evening. But if I take all of the water content out, or the moisture content out, we're left with dry matter. Okay, and now I can very easily compare each of your samples by removing the water component. Because what we're left with is the nutrient section. Okay, so we consider that on a dry matter basis. Ideally, though, your horse would consume 2 to 2.5% of its body weight on a dry matter basis every day. Okay, now we know that you, as an owner, can't just walk out and say, I think I know what the dry matter of this hay is. You need to have a forage test, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. A lot of the questions that I get about forage are like, well, man, I have my horse out grazing. How could I possibly estimate how much they eat when they're out there all day long? Right? So, work done by several different groups over time has helped us to be able to understand these values. But we can assume that if a horse is out grazing, okay, and they're actively eating, it's not just, smooth or overgrazed or lots of weed, but there's enough appropriate forage out there, greater than 3 inches tall, that animal's going to take in 1 to 1.4 pounds of dry matter every hour. And so if that horse is out for 24 hours a day, they'll typically spend somewhere between 16 to 18 hours grazing. And if we back and do the math, okay, it comes back out to between 2 to 2.5% of their body weight, which is where that recommendation comes from. And so we know, though, that not all forage is created equal. So this is something where we need to think about the species that we're feeding. Is it a legume like alfalfa or clover, or is it a grass like timothy, Bermuda, fescue, orchard grass, etc.? When do they grow, right? They're cool season versus warm season grasses or plants, which might tell us a little bit about how mature they were and what's happening with the nutrients within that plant, depending on where it is in the growing cycle. We also want to know the conditions, if possible, under which that plant was grown and harvested, because that can also potentially manipulate the nutrients contained within. Okay, and then once it was harvested and baled, how was it stored? Was it stored under cover, in a barn, out in the field? Because that can also change the nutrient content. And these are questions that you can ask your forage producer, along with asking them if they have a forage test, right? This is something that I think is one of the most underutilized nutritional tools out there, because it gives you nutritional information about what you're feeding that then you can base your other information and decisions off of. Okay, and that's critically important. So we have a lab here. I think they're $17 a piece to have your forage tested, but there's a variety of other labs across the country. And I know there's lots of states represented here. But that's something that I think could really help a lot of horse owners make better financial decisions, but also better nutritional information and decisions as well. So really quickly, let's do a quick example. Okay, we've got these two forages here. If you want to guess what they are, you can go ahead and stick those in the chat too. But both of these tell us a variety of different things about the type of forage, maybe when it was harvested, and what nutritional information this could look like. Okay. The interesting part about it, though, is that even with all of that information, all I'm doing is able to make a guess as to what the nutrient profile actually looks like. It does not tell me, unfortunately, specifically what's going on within that. And I wish it could. There's some indicators that we can guess, but not necessarily always the most reliable. Okay. Um, so if we look at this grass over here, or this hay over here, right? We start to see that there's maybe a few seed heads kind of intermixed. It does look a little stemmy, okay, but there is some leaf presence throughout. Okay, it's a little bit more on the yellow beige side maybe than the green side. Um, but maybe this is just one section of one portion of that hay that we may need to consider looking at other components and other more thorough samples to figure out these pieces. But generally speaking, I don't see a ton of seed head, but I do see a lot of stems and maybe not as much leaf as I would like. Now, if we look over here, these are two different forage species, okay? If anybody knows what this type of forage is, like I said, you can go ahead and guess. But we see this seed head, right? It looks really fluffy and soft, and it is to touch. But I also do see a lot of stems, okay? And I'm not seeing a whole lot of leaves in this particular sample. And so, again, the power of the forage test not only can allow us to ID it if we have a full sample and utilize the core to be able to come through. Um, but this down here, for those of you, I saw a few Tennessee and some others in the Southeast represented. This is broom sage or sage grass. It's a warm season native grass that grows here in Tennessee pretty easily. But unfortunately, it is a forage um, that causes mouth ulcers. And I'm going to skip ahead here just to show you due to time. But this was the same forage, the same picture that I showed you previously. But because this forage is so stemmy and sticky, it actually causes some abrasions in the mouth. And this super soft little seed head packs in there and causes ulcers. Okay. Additionally, the component that's important is that it's very energy and protein deficient. And so not only can the horse not physically eat enough of it, but it also causes these other issues throughout the GI tract. And this is a histological image where you can see pieces of the seed head are embedded in the horse's mucous membrane. And so this is just, again, an illustrating example, but this is where we could also utilize the power of a forage test, right? So just to walk you through this as an example, okay, this horse was euthanized due to a low body weight, but he weighed about 306 kilograms, which is somewhere around 650 pounds, okay? And this horse per day required 10.21 megacalories, which is the unit of energy that we use in the equine world, per day. Okay. If we assume that this horse eats enough of its diet, then we would see that this horse would have a dietary supply of energy of 9.5, which puts this horse in what we call a negative energy balance. And so we would expect that he would lose weight, even though this horse was already fairly emaciated. And so from there, if we look at crude protein, right, we take the horse's body weight and calculate out that it would need 386 grams of protein. But this forage was really low. It was about 4% of the dietary supply, or 4% crude protein, which leaves us in a balance of negative 145. Okay, so what would we do, right? Say this is the only forage that's available to us. It's not ideal. We wouldn't recommend feeding it, but for whatever reason, we might have to. Well, now that's when we look to a concentrate. Okay, so we should look and try to feed concentrates when we have nutritional deficiencies throughout the course of the horse's diet. And so if we look, we can think about those in a variety of different ways, including grains, right? Different ingredient grains like rolled oats, cracked corn, and things like that. Okay. We also might look at byproducts, things like beet pulp. Okay. And I apologize, this copied twice and I'm not sure why. But things like beet pulp, soybean meal that we're adding into a diet for a very specific purpose that allows us then to be able to change the profile of that diet a little bit. So I might add beet pulp to add extra fiber and energy to the diet. We might add soybean meal to increase the protein quality and quantity. Okay. Then we look at commercial concentrates, and I apologize that this picture did not come through, but we have a variety of different ones that may be present out in the market, right? So this might be something like a sweet feed that has identifiable grains within it, usually a vitamin mineral pellet, and then it has a little bit of extra molasses. We also have a pelleted option, okay, that's here where everything is ground down into a more uniform consistency, so the horse can't sort out what it likes and what it doesn't like with that prehensile lip. And then the one that's missing over here is what we call an extruded pellet, often labeled as a complete feed in the horse market, that allows us to be able to manipulate and increase the fat, but also the fiber content in those pellets as well. So it's important to understand what you're getting, okay, based on what's labeled in the bag, and then respectively what nutrients that fills in accordingly. Okay. And so when do we use a concentrate? Well, like I said, we want to use it when the nutritional needs are not met by forage alone. So we're informing ourselves with ideally at least a physical assessment of that hay to get an understanding of what nutrients might be there, but ideally with a forage test. Then we can look at it and say, hey, your horse might be just a little bit deficient in a mineral. So maybe we're going to add a ration balancing product like a vitamin mineral balancer. Or if we're deficient with protein too, we might add a ration balancing product. The second bullet here is really important. Okay, selecting based on class or production status. So say I have a mare that's pregnant. I want to look for a type of feed that is labeled for a mare that is currently pregnant or in lactation, right? Because that bag has been formulated by a nutritionist or a team of nutritionists to meet that animal's needs, ideally with a variety of different forages that could be fed. Okay. And feeding the way it's designed on the label is also really important. Okay. And I'll show you just a quick example of that as we wrap up. Excuse me, feeding a maximum, okay, as fed or as it is in the bag, of no more than 0.75% of the horse's body weight per meal. What this means is that we're not feeding, again, that 70 or that 1,000-pound horse would get no more than 7.5 pounds per meal, okay, which might be a lot depending on the type of feed, but that's generally a good rule to follow. Okay, and if we're buying that commercial concentrate, don't mix it, right? Don't cut it with oats or your grandpa's special horse mixture. Feed it the way that manufacturer designed by weight based on the bag. Okay, so I'm just going to show you, this is Purina Strategy just as an example, because I know that it's a feed that's usually fairly available throughout the country. And this is taken right off of the manufacturer's website. But if you look, it's showing you the horse weight in pounds. Again, knowing your horse's body weight is important. And it's saying, okay, about how much hay or equivalent pasture does your horse eat per day, right? So again, we're trying to get an estimate of, are you feeding 12 pounds or are you feeding 18 pounds of hay per day? And then is the animal in work, light, moderate, heavy, or very heavy? Is the horse in gestation or lactation, or is it a breeding stallion? Okay, Purina Strategy also is marketed for a weaned foal through a yearling, okay, based again on their body weight. And so being able to measure out that amount and feed it the way the manufacturer recommends lets you know that hopefully that horse is getting all of the nutrients it needs and filling in any holes that are missing by the forage. Okay, and as we wrap up, I would be remiss if I didn't mention water. It's super important, and your horses should always have clean, free choice access to water, always, right? I'm one of those people that thinks that the horses should have as clean and appropriate water source as I would think is acceptable. Okay, so how we do that and how we make sure that that happens and cleaning the water troughs is certainly a challenge at times. Okay, we can determine how much water your horse might need, depending on, again, on their weight, right, their production status, and then some other environmental factors. I mean, we didn't talk too much about how that might manipulate the other nutrients, but it certainly does, but especially water needs as well. In most areas, unless your horse is specifically acclimatized to eating snow, we do not consider snow and ice a water source. So especially if you live in an area of the country where you have a lot of snow and ice present, your horse might go out there and lick it or eat it occasionally, but we don't consider that to be a formalized water source. Okay. And in periods of sweating or heavy sweating, we may see that we might need some additional electrolytes, and that's okay, primarily in the form of sodium, potassium, and chloride. And so just to give you a general rough estimate, okay, if we look at the class over here, so again, a horse at maintenance, not in any other production status, and we look at how their range of water intake changes through different temperatures, right? What I think is really interesting is that in temperatures greater than 86 degrees Fahrenheit or less than 0 degrees Fahrenheit, their water intake is actually fairly similar, right? And we see that because typically in colder temperatures, like it is tonight here in Tennessee, we're due for some snow. Um, the horses probably are going to be consuming usually more preserved forage in the form of hay, which has a fairly low moisture content. So they need to make up that additional water consumption through drinking, right? To help prevent impaction, allow them to be able to do all the things that their body needs to do day to day, right? Additionally, look at the difference between pregnancy and lactation, right? We go from 7 to 9 gallons in the 1,000 pound horse and almost double that to almost triple in the lactating mare. So, understanding that your horse might drink differently and what's normal to your horse can also help to be a really big indicator of their overall health status. Okay, so in review and as we wrap up and get ready for questions, remember that the digestive system functions differently. They're hindgut fermenters. We didn't get to talk about the fact that they also don't have a gallbladder. Sometimes, like a lot of us that maybe don't also have a gallbladder, the horses don't as well, and they have those teeth that continually erupt and other things we need to consider. Knowing your horse's body weight and body condition is also very important, and for us being able to calculate nutrient requirements. Feed the forage first. Okay, please, please, please. And utilize a forage test. And if you're not sure how to interpret it, reach out to someone, use your extension programs, etc., to be able to help you interpret those results. Then we look to concentrates and potentially supplements to help fill in any needed nutrient deficiencies based on what the animal needs. Always offer free choice water, and again, feed by weight and not by volume. And so, Dr. Williams, I hope I left at least a few minutes for questions. But what can I help to answer from the audience?
Awesome. Yes, thank you. Let's give Dr. Ivey a big virtual round of applause. I can ask you to go ahead and stop sharing your screen. That way we can just see you on camera, and I will start rifling off a couple questions because you got a few in here. So let's go back all the way to your anatomy slides because we got a good question here that I might have missed, and maybe you said it, maybe you didn't. How long does it take for various foods or feedstuffs to go through the horse's digestive system?
Yeah, so the foregut typically takes around 4-ish hours. And so again, that's where they're passing through from the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, and the small intestine. On the flip side, though, the hindgut would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 to 72 hours. And so that fermentation process takes a lot longer to be able to break down those fibers and produce those volatile fatty acids. And also remember, we're having water and mineral reabsorption and vitamin absorption in that hindgut. And so much longer in the hindgut than it is in the foregut.
Awesome. Great answer. This one's probably a quickie. Is there a weight tape specifically for mules, or what adjustments would you make?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in that Healthy Horse app, and the group from Minnesota did release a paper on donkeys and other equids. And so I think that that's something that we can help to connect you with. I'm not familiar with a specific mule and donkey weight tape that currently exists, which is kind of unfortunate because we know that there's such a need to understand how to better manage those equids. But I would direct you, again, not only to your veterinarian and extension and nutritionist, but also to the donkey sanctuary. They have a lot of really good references about feeding and managing donkeys and mules. And it's a website that you can go to. And I think they also have like a Ask the Expert feature on their website. So I would look there if you're looking for specific donkey or mule information.
Yeah, great recommendation. So when you were talking about concentrates, this question says, why didn't you also mention pelleted or cubed forage instead of adding concentrate?
Yeah, so that's a great option, and something that we see a lot of owners use very effectively. I didn't get to talk about it tonight because we were up against the time barrier, but that's certainly a great option, especially one that we see recommended a lot for horses that might be slightly overweight, that we're looking to maybe need to find something in a bucket that we can add for maybe medications or other things that we need to feed, or to make them feel like they're not left out, right? If their buddies down the hall are getting some concentrate and they're on a little bit of a diet. So pelleted forages, cubed forages can be a great addition to filling in some of those nutritional holes that's not met by your long-stemmed hays, or it could be a great option for horses that don't have good dentition, right? So we look to some of those products to help us if the horse maybe can't chew as well. One of the challenges, though, and I see some owners look to it maybe a little bit too soon, is that they are more expensive than your traditional baled hays. So, from a pound per pound basis, a little cheaper than your commercial concentrates, but not cheaper than your baled forages.
Good answer there. A lot on forages, which is great because that was kind of the take home message. So, if you're feeding, excuse me, a supplemental forage like alfalfa cubes, but also need to add a concentrate, do you still need to feed what's recommended on the bag? Would that be too much? What are we concerned about? And how do I know how to adjust accordingly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I see a lot of owners look to multiple products to try to maybe fill in known or unknown nutritional gaps, right? And I would probably say to think back about what we talked about this evening and start simple, right? So what does the animal require, even if all you can do is a weight tape? And let's get some numbers on the board. And think about how much other forage you're feeding and why we're looking to both an alfalfa and a concentrate, right? And there's a good chance that we might be able to drop one or the other depending on the animal's need, right? So we see a lot of people look to alfalfa maybe because they're trying to increase protein or maybe they want to increase energy because we know that legumes are a little bit more energy and protein dense than their grass counterparts. Usually, right? There's always exceptions. But are we also then looking to the concentrate product to do the same things? And so I would say go back and think about what the diet components are providing. Ideally, meet with a nutritionist to help you sort those pieces out and figure out which product is really the best to meet the needs of your horse at this time.
Great. Good answers. I'm going to cheat and kind of roll two of them into one for our last question. But Dr. Ivey did say she would stay on for a little bit. She'll pop into the Q&A and she'll answer some of the questions that we didn't get to. So I really hate to have everybody not get their questions answered. So kind of the last one is, how do you figure out how much free choice hay my horse would need specifically in the winter? But I think that's a good general question too. And would you recommend putting this in a hay net or not?
Yeah, so when we think about managing horses through the winter, right? Usually I tell people to kind of think about maintaining an appropriate body condition score. So if I have a horse that's maybe a little bit underweight and I'm coming into the winter months, not only do I want to make sure they don't lose weight, but I probably want that horse to gain weight as well. So that's where we're thinking about the primary and the secondary requirements together. If I just want that horse to maintain, I might not do a whole lot different, right? Especially if you live in a more temperate area where the temperatures are not fluctuating nearly as much as what we might see in other portions of the country. Um, if we think about how much they actually need, we go back to those percentages I shared earlier, right? Around 2% of the body weight is safe. You could even go 2.5 if you want to give yourself a buffer, since you might not have the dry matter as fed components. And so if we have that 1,000 pound horse, somewhere between 20 to 25 pounds of hay is probably acceptable. Okay. If we think about then, do we feed it in a hay net or not? I would probably come back and say, how quick does your horse clean that hay up? Is he a hog and just puts his face in and is like, I will not be coming out of this hay pile until I'm done. Thank you very much. Or do they eat a little bit and walk away? If they're that first option, a slow feed hay net, right, with a smaller opening, maybe 1.5 inches or so, could be really helpful to slow them down and make sure that they stretch that hay throughout the day. If they're not, or maybe you're feeding a poor quality forage, which is not necessarily a bad thing, you might want to be able to use a little bit of a wider opening in that hay net. But I will stay on and answer additional questions. But thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ivey. Let's give her another virtual round of applause. This is great. Sorry I did not get to answer all the questions live, but she is going to start to tackle some more of those as we switch over. So I'd like to now invite Dr. Macon to the screen, and she can unmute her video, I was going to say, but take yourself on video and then go ahead and share your screen, and I am going to give you an introduction. So I specifically tailored today to cover the very basics first, and now to go into something that I continually get asked about all the time for people to want to know more and more and more and more information on, which is how do we feed horses with metabolic problems, or specifically endocrine diseases. So Dr. Erica Macon has been doing a lot of research in her time as a graduate student, postdoc, and now at Texas A&M, which is where she's at. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science there. She teaches undergrads, graduate students, DVMs as well, all on nutrition and equine health and disease. And as I mentioned, her research program is on uncovering how insulin dysregulation develops, as well as improving current nutritional practices and developing new nutritional guidelines for horses with this potentially debilitating endocrine disease. So I am going to listen closely because I get these questions all the time, which is why you're here, Dr. Macon. I'm going to shut up and let you take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you, Dr. Ivy. I found some really interesting points in your lecture I may actually incorporate into some of my teaching as well. So I appreciate that. So really we're going to focus on the two endocrine diseases, the two most common that horses can suffer from. And that is insulin dysregulation and pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, also known as Cushing's. So a bit of a roadmap of how I'm going to go down and explain these things. First, I want to kind of just generalize what is an endocrine disorder, and then we'll go into the two individual disorders that we know in horses, and then I'll come back after I talk a little bit about what they are, how you diagnose them, and then we'll come back to nutritional considerations for either a singular disorder or a horse that has both, which I refer to as a double whammy. So first, let's talk about equine endocrine disorders. So when we think of endocrine, we normally think of a gland or an organ within the body that secretes a hormone, and multiple parts of the body, multiple tissues, including fat, the gastrointestinal system, and the small intestine. These are actually endocrine organs because they do synthesize and secrete a hormone. And these hormones are signaling molecules that regulate physiological function. Some of them kind of just use as more as a coordinator of, hey, something's happening over here. We need a part of the body to respond. And that's what I mean by action. So without these hormones and these signaling molecules, a lot of our physiological and metabolic functions would cease to exist because we absolutely need to have these hormones in order to function properly. Like I said, there's many different types of endocrine organs. This particular figure was made before we knew that fat tissue and small intestine, and even now we know muscle makes myokines, and the multiple different parts of the body can synthesize and secrete hormones. And while there is a ton of them, we're not going to focus them on all of them except the pituitary and the pancreas. And the pituitary, because it makes adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and that particular hormone is elevated in a cushingoid, Cushing's horse, or pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction horse. I will say PPID for the rest of the presentation. And then the pancreas makes a very important hormone that probably a lot are familiar with, which is insulin. And this hormone is the key component in metabolic syndrome and insulin dysregulation. And I'm going to kind of go through the language of what those two mean. So let's start with insulin dysregulation. So back when this was first characterized was back in 2002, which I know that's, over 20 years ago. But in terms of research and what we know about this in the past 20 years has gone exponentially. When we first talked about having obese horses, and Dr. Ivy kind of alluded to the crusty neck score and body condition and things like this, we often saw horses that were obese, or I say fluffy, had chronic laminitis, and if you were to take some blood, they had a lot of triglycerides or fat in their blood, which was very similar to what we call in humans human metabolic syndrome. And humans also have tissue insulin resistance, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So this was first characterized in horses, metabolic syndrome, or EMS, 2002, and the first consensus statement came out, I believe, in 2010. But now we know that there's a difference between EMS and insulin dysregulation, and hopefully I can make this clear. So on the right-hand side, we have metabolic syndrome. This is a collective term for characteristics that are found in horses. Oftentimes these horses are obese, they have crusty necks, they're really fluffy behind the withers, they have nice rounded rumps if you look at them from the back. These horses probably have a history of laminitis, or they have laminitic hoof rings, some separation. And these horses also, most of them have insulin dysregulation. And the key component of why EMS is different from insulin dysregulation is because we now know that there are very lean phenotypes of horses that have insulin dysregulation that are not obese at all. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. So now what we say insulin dysregulation is we're actually referring to what goes wrong with insulin secretion and its actions. So insulin dysregulation is a collective term for both tissue insulin resistance as well as hyperinsulinemia, or a lot of insulin in the blood. And I'm going to walk through these a little bit more later, so don't worry. So tissue insulin resistance, if we think about having a healthy horse versus a what we call an IR, or a tissue insulin resistant horse, this is kind of how I put it together. So you have a meal. A meal comes into the GI system. That horse needs to break it down, digest it, and absorb those nutrients. And in this case, if it's glucose, you have to have that glucose be taken into tissues like the muscle and the liver, even to the heart, because the heart is a big muscle. In order for that glucose to be shuttled into respective tissues, it is an insulin dependent process. So it needs insulin to do this. So in a healthy horse, they only have to secrete a little bit amount of insulin, and that glucose will get absorbed into their respective tissues, and their blood sugar will come back down. Now, in an insulin resistant horse, their insulin is no longer as effective as a healthy horse's insulin, or their sensitivity. So they have to secrete a bunch more insulin to get the same type of reaction for their tissues. And most of this insulin, we're not quite sure if it's not binding to receptors that are on these target tissues, or if it just isn't enough in general. But this is kind of how we think about tissue insulin resistance. So that means that their glucose will stay higher for longer periods in their blood and won't be shuttled as fast. And then when we think about hyperinsulinemia, or just high insulin concentrations, we can have them at rest, and as well as postprandially, or after a meal. So in a healthy horse, again, if they eat a meal like these little bowl of carrots here, their insulin, normally a good level for resting insulin is 20 international units per mil. And so that's pretty low. So when that horse eats that meal, digests it, and starts absorbing that glucose, they might have a tiny little spot and a peak where their insulin has to go up in order to shuttle that glucose. And that's okay, because it'll come back down to be normal. Now, the problem for post-meal hyperinsulinemia and insulin dysregulated horses is that their insulin sometimes is already elevated. So say that it's no longer at 20, and now it's at 80. And so when they eat, it's going to go even higher than that. And that may trigger a laminitis event. And this, not all horses have resting hyperinsulinemia. I see the most severe cases of metabolic syndrome have resting as well as post-meal hyperinsulinemia. It just really depends, and it's very horse specific, and that's why I always try to characterize each horse. So a little question for you guys. Out of these horses, who do you think has EMS and insulin dysregulation? There's one horse that has EMS, and there's one horse that has insulin dysregulation. I'll give you a second to think about it. So, first of all, oh, come back. Maybe you all probably thought this, but you can see that this horse has a big old crusty neck, and he has a lot of fat behind his shoulders. He even has some fat on his tail head. So he is a horse that has metabolic syndrome. He has insulin dysregulation. He has the obesity. He has high fat in his blood, and he has had chronic laminitis in the past. Now, this horse actually has insulin dysregulation, and you can see, hopefully you can see that there's a little bit of rib showing on this horse. This is a 12-year-old Tennessee walking horse. You can also see that this horse does not have a crusty neck, but her resting insulins in this picture were over 500. So when we think about metabolic syndrome and insulin dysregulation, we really have to start letting go of every horse that has insulin dysregulation has to be fat, and they don't, because this is one of the first ones that I saw, and I've seen much more since then. And of course, the top A picture, that horse has Cushing's or PPID. So why is insulin dysregulation a problem? And hopefully I have a few slides to kind of keep reiterating why this is a problem. But again, as I stated previously, healthy horses have low insulin levels. Now, if they eat a little bit of something, it might rise a little bit just to show that glucose where it needs to go and it come back down to normal. For horses that have tissue insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, that's not the same curve for them. So they're already starting, sometimes, not all the time, starting at a very high level, and then when you give them something, they go up to even higher level. Now we know today that there are receptors within the lamina of the foot. So this is a cross section of two different horses. This one on the left-hand side, this is a normal, healthy-looking foot cross-section. The coffin bone is parallel to the hoof wall. The lamina don't look upset. This horse died for different reasons other than laminitis, but as a good comparison to this horse that had chronic laminitis. And you can even see in the difference between the depth of sole in the non-laminitic horse versus the laminitic horse. You have this big, huge lamellar wedge that is developed. The lamina are just very inflamed and upset, and the coffin bone looks like it's rotated a little bit. We now know today, through many of different experiments, that there are actually insulin receptors within the lamina. So if you think about insulin being very high, that insulin can travel throughout the bloodstream, which goes all over the horse, just like it does in you and I, and that insulin can bind in the foot. For whatever reason, and why this happens, we still don't understand, but when that insulin binds within the lamina of the foot, the lamina interdigitate like this to hold the coffin bone parallel to the hoof wall. When the insulin binds, it swells, the lamina swell, and they let go. And that allows that coffin bone to rotate down. But before it rotates, that inflammation of insulin binding in the lamina is really when you start seeing a problem. And I've seen this time and time again. So the diagnosis of insulin dysregulation, resting insulins, we say they need to be below 20. We always say if you're looking at resting insulins, it can be very tricky because not all horses have resting hyperinsulinemia. So sometimes you can miss a diagnosis by just doing a resting insulin quantification. So I always really do push for a more dynamic test. However, if you do get a horse that has insulin over 50 at a resting state, so they haven't eaten any grain, they can come off of pasture or hay. Normally that doesn't really affect it as much as a grain meal will. But I really do push a normal sugar test because this will really show what will happen after your horse eats something. How high can their insulins go? This is really a challenge of really pushing what their metabolism is. And we can also see if they were to eat something, is something safe for them to eat? And we'll talk about meal challenges and stuff a little bit later. But after that, we actually just give them Caro syrup, which I always get funny looks when I go into Kroger and buy loads of Caro syrup. And they always think I'm cooking a cake, and then I tell them what I'm doing. And then they have a really good laugh, and they still don't understand why I use all that Caro. But it's very easy. Your veterinarian will know how to do one. They pull it up based off of body weight. Hopefully they're using the Healthy Horse app or using a sewing tape and figure it and doing the calculations. And they'll dose that, and 60 minutes later take another blood sample and quantify their insulin levels. And if it's over 45, we see that horse is hyperinsulinemic or is insulin dysregulated. And to give you just an example of how easy it is, this is one of my old research horses. His name was Titan. And as you can tell, he looks like a Titan. He absolutely adores oral sugar test day because it's just his favorite. He actually used to chase me in the field to try to get the syringes from me. And he would break most of them because he wanted to get the sugar. And he's very photogenic, as you can tell. But most metabolic horses really do like oral sugar tests. Okay, moving on to PPID, and then we'll come back to nutritional considerations, like I said at the end. So PPID, also known as Cushing's, we really think of this as a geriatric horse disease. However, I will add a caveat that a lot of veterinarians are starting to diagnose Cushing's at much younger ages than at 15. And that kind of makes sense to us because we don't really know when these adenomas within the pituitary, or a tumor, a benign tumor in the pituitary, start developing. They could be developing at a much younger age, and we don't actually see clinical symptoms until they're much older. So I think a little bit more of research will start going down this path of how can we start to detect adenoma formation or something very similar to that. But that's kind of just the caveat that I have heard of horses diagnosed with PPID at a much younger age than 15. But again, we consider this to be a geriatric horse disease. They're most known for hypertrichosis and delayed shedding, or just having those really long, shaggy hair coats. Sometimes you'll see like patchy hair, and I have pictures of that here in the next slide. These horses will also have what we call sarcopenia, or muscle wasting due to age, or just atrophy in general, and that normally occurs over the top line, over the croup and the rump. Sometimes you can see some in the chest, but the most noticeable is in the top line. And why this happens, we're not quite sure, but I think there are a few researchers that are trying to investigate this currently. These horses will also have recurrent infections, and sometimes they'll be very lethargic. So they kind of will seem really sad, down, and depressed. And this may, develop over a couple months, or it may be, one day they just seem that way. And I've seen a few horses diagnosed that they couldn't figure out what was wrong with the horse. They had recurrent infections on the leg, or they just weren't able to perform as well. And then they finally got a diagnosis of Cushing's, and they started treating, and that horse came back to being able to be used again. Another couple others are tendon and ligament laxity, and I have a picture of that. Why this happens, we're not quite sure either. Their suspensory just kind of gets a little bit weakened. And then polyuria or polydipsia, so they're drinking a lot and they're peeing a lot. And this is because of the hormone cascade that has no negative feedback anymore because of that adenoma in the pituitary. And this number, the percentage of horses that we thought used to have Cushing's actually went up by 10%. So now we think 30% of senior horses actually have Cushing's, which is getting to be a much higher number. Obviously, our horses are living longer. We're treating them better. They have great nutrition, sometimes too much nutrition. And it makes sense that, okay, they're living longer. They're going to have some other things develop. I think this is why you'll see this number continue to increase. So here's an example of that really shaggy coat. And then these are two different horses. But here on this horse, you can see that there's like shagginess in just on the leg portions. Sometimes it's really on the underside of the abdomen that you see it. And then the muscle atrophy that this particular horse has is pretty extreme. And this could be for a number of reasons other than them having Cushing's, but to give you a drastic image of what muscle atrophy looks like. And then, of course, I said about ligament laxity. So they're kind of sitting back a little bit in the pastern. That's what I was referring to. Okay, so let's talk about this adenoma that I keep referring to in the pituitary. So in the brain, within the brain, there's a part called the hypothalamus, and then there's this little gland right below it called the pituitary. There's a front half, and then there's a back half, and then there's a middle half that combines the two. So normally, hormones need another hormone or some kind of neural stimulus to be secreted. So the hypothalamus has these little neurons that basically communicate with the pituitary to say, hey, you need to send another signal down. We need to release a hormone. And these little neurons are called dopaminergic neurons, which means that they're dopamine centered. So they use the hormone dopamine to communicate between hypothalamus and the pituitary. Now, when you get this communication pathway started and you activate those dopaminergic neurons, they normally say, hey, we need to stop secreting hormones from the pituitary. That way we can stop the cascade that goes down to the rest of the body. Because if you mess with one hormone, you mess with them all. That's just my personal opinion. So when that adenoma forms within the pituitary, so you have the front and the back half, that adenoma will come right here in the middle. And that oftentimes damages those dopaminergic neurons. So then when the hypothalamus is talking to the pituitary, it can no longer say, hey, you need to stop secreting those hormones. So instead, it hypersecretes ACTH, and that leads to all of the outward clinical symptoms that we see in these horses. To diagnose this, people can certainly use resting blood samples for ACTH. However, we know since horses are seasonal breeders that ACTH will be affected by season. And so we really do recommend doing another dynamic test called the thyroid releasing hormone stimulation test. So they'll give a very small dose of thyroid releasing hormone intravenously. That thyroid releasing hormone will travel through, go to the brain. It actually stimulates the pituitary to make ACTH. It's just a big burst of ACTH. A normal horse will have, their ACTH will go up, but not by very much. A horse that has an adenoma in their pituitary, it will skyrocket. And I've seen very large numbers in these particular hormone. And talking about that seasonal change. So this graph here, very, very busy, but this is just representing the 52 weeks out of the year. This little rise right here is, we think of the fall rise, as most horses are going in, getting ready to be into season to start breeding again. We'll have that rise in ACTH, as well as they're getting ready for breeding season, as well as putting on fat to get through the winter. So we now have multiple studies that have given us some great reference ranges. And you have baseline samples down here, and then you have the actual TRH. So you inject TRH and then 10 minutes later take another blood sample and quantify it. But now we have some pretty precise measurements of when we can diagnose definitively. Like if in December through June, if it's less than 15, we're not normally concerned. However, if you go to, September and October, if it doubles in that, then perhaps they might be. So we have that gray zone of interpretation. If the horse's values fall within these numbers and these ranges, you may need to move on to do a dynamic test. And of course, just like insulin dysregulation, we have values where we're like, yeah, they're definitely have Cushing's or something's going on. But your veterinarian, whatever lab they use to quantify these values, they will have these reference ranges. These reference ranges are updated almost yearly based on new research. So your veterinarian will be able to really distinctively diagnose. Okay, so the whole reason you're here, talk about nutritional considerations for horses with endocrine disease. So the hyperinsulinemic or insulin dysregulated horse. This horse in the picture is a horse that I was working on for a couple years. Unfortunately, we lost her to a bout of laminitis that she just couldn't get past. But you can tell she's not morbidly obese. The owner said that this horse was in great condition, and you can tell that you can't really see ribs, so she's a little bit over a 5, and she might have a little bit of fluff to her, but she's not morbidly obese. And we worked on this horse for 2 years, and she did some really good nutritional management, got everything right, and then she got into some really high starch feed, and that set off a laminitic episode. So why is nutrition important for these guys? And I've kind of alluded to it when I was talking about diagnosis. So if you have a healthy horse, their insulin levels are already much lower. Whenever they eat, so say they're eating a textured grain or something, not that a metabolic horse should ever eat a textured grain, but as just an example, that horse's insulin levels will go up just a little bit to process that glucose, and that the insulin won't be high in the blood for very long, so that's not going to affect the lamina, and that should be just fine. But in an insulin dysregulated horse that has resting hyperlinsulemia or has post-meal hyperlinsulemia, they probably have insulin levels that are already pretty high. So if we feed them something that has high sugar and high starch, it's going to go even higher. And that high amount of insulin is going to fluctuate within the blood. It can travel down to the hoof. It can start binding in the lamina, and this can induce a bout of laminitis. So research has showed us that the laminitis threshold is roughly between 2 and 300 international units per mil of insulin. So we want to try to stay away from those values as much as possible. This figure was taken out of some of my work. We were really looking to try to differentiate if we could actually get a much lower response in concentrated feedstuffs. So the CC is cracked corn, and the OG is oat groats or dehulled oats. The SFC is steam flake corn, and then the RBHP is a ration balancer with high protein, and then this LNSC is a very low non-structural carbohydrate pelleted food. And if you can appreciate the black bars, these are healthy horses. They some of them respond a little bit, but not very much at all. But then the gray bars are insulin dysregulated horses. They have massive, massive responses. However, if you look at this low NSC feed, they don't respond as drastically to some of these other cereal grains. And so this is one of the first studies where we're like, oh, they can respond normally. We just need to limit their non-structural carbs. And multiple other studies after this one showed that if you decrease their NSC to 0.1 grams per kilo per body weight, you could stop an exaggerated post-meal insulin response. And you're probably thinking, I'd never see 0.1 grams of NSC per kilogram body weight on a back. You're absolutely right, and we're going to walk through it. But we can't really say percentages anymore because we don't know, 2 feeds could be a 10 and a 15% NSC. However, depending upon where that NSC is coming from, how much volume of that meal you're going to have to feed, there's just so many things in there that we can't just go off percentages alone anymore. And hopefully I can kind of go through that. So if we limit NSC, so say we have a 10% NSC, I said, no, we're not going by percentages, but this is just for the example, versus a 15% NSC. So that horse, a healthy and an ID horse, they're going to digest this. Their glucose is going to skyrocket really high because it has a lot of carbs in it. And that in turn, for the healthy horse, they'll probably have a big spike too, but the ID horse is going to have a much higher response, and this is dangerous for them versus something that has much lower NSC, that have a much lower glycemic response, and that's going to produce much lower insulin responses, which is why this is very key. So for pelleted feedstuffs, if we think about what types of grains are best for these horses, you've probably seen a bunch that are low NSC, low sugar, low starch, weight control. Maybe there's an Easy Keeper bag out there. I'm not sure because there's so many. These are really good for horses that have that need weight when they're insulin dysregulated, like that chestnut mare that I showed you at the beginning. She classically needed more calories to try to maintain her weight, but she had insulin dysregulation. So we used to soak her feed and take the water out, which took the sugar out. So that helped her a little bit. Pelleted hays, you have to make sure on an actual pellet or a cube, look at the binder and make sure it's not some kind of sugar basis, because that's just going to contribute more to an insulin response. So really check and make sure what's in the ingredients list. I know for Stanley pellets, they don't have any high sugar binders, but I can't speak for smaller ones. That's just the one that I'm familiar with. Sometimes if you have horses on supplements, and they could be a very wide range of supplements, joints, keeping him from colicking or whatever other supplement that you feed your horse, sometimes these have a lot of sugar in them. So really check the guaranteed analysis and make sure that they have minimal sugar, minimal starch in them. And of course, make sure if you're ever needing to feed some more fiber, you don't have anything that's bound with molasses, like molasses beet pulp. And then for sugar content of forages, well, I say sugar because starch is going to be pretty minimal in forages. We're really more concerned about the sugar content. Of course, for those that are down here in Texas, we classically feed warm season hays because we don't have any cold season hays down here. But I would prefer a warm season, then an alfalfa, then a cold season hay, because cold season hays can have pretty much a lot of sugar in them. But you can also remove, if you soak soak those hays and remove the water, you kind of leach all that sugar out. So that's a pretty good practice. Now, where do you find these NSC values? There's multiple places you can find them. You can find them on the back of a bag. Sometimes these are listed as mins and maxes, and it's kind of hard to determine what exactly is in it. You could always, as I do, Google search it. Or another way, a much easier way that a lot of us, I think, are operating these days is by using Madbard's feed bank. They just have a bunch of horse feeds out there and have them all tabulated really nicely. So I'm going to kind of walk through that. You can go to madbarn.com. You can type in a feed, whatever feed. For this one, I said low and steady from Buckeye. That feed will pop up, and then you'll scroll down to the bottom of the page and you'll go to the nutritional analysis, and you can hit a summary, the protein, the carbs, minerals, and vitamins, fat, different additives. But really focusing on the carb panel, they have both the sugar and the starch separated out. And then they have NSC, which NSC is just the addition of sugar and starch together to give you a total value. So low and steady has 9.4% of NSC. But again, we're not operating off of percentages anymore. We have something else to work off of. Oh, I had other bars. I forgot about that. So, and I'm going to share this with Dr. Williams, and you guys are welcome to use it. I presented this at this year's American Association of Equine Practitioners for your veterinarians to hopefully start using it as well, but kind of just a guide of how to actually make these numbers and to really figure it out. And I won't walk through the entire example, but you have to get a few things in order to figure out these calculations. You have to know how much your horse weighs, and Dr. Ivey's already talked a lot about that. For just the basis of these calculations, I try to make it as simple as possible and get the percentage of the NSC, and then know how much your horse is going to eat in a singular meal, not all day, but a singular meal. And then convert your horse's weight from pounds to kilograms, and then convert your feeding rate, and then you go through the individual steps in the math. But if this is I can't remember which feed this was. Oh, this Triple Crown Light. So this this individual feed will give and provide 0.43 grams of NSC per kilogram of body weight. Now, my thresholds that I had previously found, it was 0.1, with a caveat that was with pure sources of sugar and starch. So we think that it's probably between 0.1 and 0.2, somewhere in there. So if you really wanted to feed this, then cut the meal in half, and then that's basically gonna decrease it by 50%. So you're controlling the volume of how much they're eating. And I have an example of it on the next slide, but just make sure, just because a feed says that it's low NSC doesn't mean that it is. I also presented this at the practitioners meeting to kind of give an idea of how much NSC is in these feeds. And then the blue percentages are how much starch, which my work also found that they're more sensitive to starch than they are sugar. So some of these are pretty high, and I had tacked in Buckeye low and steady because it wasn't out on the market until after I did the presentation. But we have some really good low NSC feeds out on the market, and you can practically get anything off of Chewy.com these days. So remember when I said to reduce the volume of the feedstuffs? This is what I mean. So we had a horse that ate a ration balancer, a full meal of a ration balancer, which is not very much. It's normally 1 to 2 pounds, depending upon the size of the horse. And if you look at the full ration, they had resting hyperlinsemia. We fed them, and 60 minutes later, their insulin was almost up to the limiting threshold, which is very scary. But then we cut that meal in half and divided it into 2 different meals, and that her insulin level was basically flat. So if we really control the volume and the amount of NST they get in a meal, the better off their insulin responses are going to be. I'm actually working on a lot of these things right now. So implementing some nutritional management strategies, slow feeders, those specialized hay nets, the hay balls. I have them for my own thoroughbreds just so they don't get bored. And there's also different concentrate feeds where they really slow them down. There's been some work in healthy horses that have shown if you slow them down, you might be able to decrease that peak in insulin after. And then, of course, depending on where you are, you really need to restrict grazing, especially in the early afternoon. That's when sugar is going to be highest. And using muzzles to try to decrease their intake as much as possible. Ideally, if they have resting hyperlipidemia, I'd keep them on a dry lot and implement, the hay ball or specialized hay nets that have really small openings. There's quite a few different companies now that are making those. And of course, I've said this a couple times, soak the feedstuffs and remove the water. Don't let them have the water, because that's where all the sugar is going to be. And then continuous monitoring for these guys. Even if you get the weight off, if you are trying to get weight off of them, or if you have a lean phenotype of insulin dysregulation where you don't need to get any weight off, you really need to make sure that when this horse is going to have really high insulin levels, and you need to be responding accordingly. So I really say monitor their oral sugar test responses. I like to see them in the fall and the spring so I can get an idea of when their highest levels will be. And I did some work on seasonal insulin responses where winter, so early winter, so probably end of October, 1st of November. This is when insulin started to rise, and then they continued to rise until the spring. So I really like to test in the late fall and in the spring to see where those insulins are. And then what I recommend for a lot of owners these days is whatever you decide to put your horse on for feeding, do some post meal testing to make sure their insulins aren't going up high on whatever feed stuff you gave them. And you can talk to your vet. You guys can set this up. I do this with a lot of clients that reach out to me. Okay. PPID. So now that we know that insulin dysregulation is a separate endocrine disease from PPID, because we used to think that PPID meant chronic laminitis, and it doesn't mean that anymore. They're two separate endocrine diseases. But the secondary complications of PPID, and the two most important, are that loss of that top line musculature, as well as having, they do have laminitis and history of laminitis, because their ACTH levels that are much, much higher put them at risk for developing the other endocrine disease of insulin dysregulation. So Dr. Pat Harris did some really great reviews on how to feed these horses. And for muscle atrophy, we still don't understand why their muscle just wastes away. But in order to try to help keep that from happening, we want to have really quality protein sources, not quantity. They don't need a massive amount. They need quality. So adding a ration balancer or adding an amino acid supplement for these guys and actually working those muscles, trotting them over some small cavaletti poles, or really making them pick up, like scratching their belly, making them pick up in their back to try to work those muscles as much as you can so that you can stop that atrophy from happening until research can find some better options for you. And again, I said that these horses are more prone to laminitis because of their high ACTH values. And a recent paper showed that that was correlated with insulin dysregulation diagnosis. So you really want to limit non-structural carbs for these horses if they have insulin dysregulation. If they just have PPID and you're having a hard time maintaining their weight, they can have all of the concentrate in order to supplement to try to reach their caloric needs if they don't have insulin dysregulation. And I see a lot of people that feed cushion-oyed horses like they're metabolic horses when really they don't need to be fed that way. And then there's the double whammy. When you have the worst case scenario, you have horses that have both endocrine diseases. This top picture here, you can tell this is a obese, insulin dysregulated horse, and this horse also has PPID. And then probably the worst case is when you have a lean ID, PPID horse. This is actually my colleague's old Arabian mare. And you can tell she has some muscle atrophy in her top line. She has that kind of pot belly, and a lot of those PPID horses are known to have kind of pot belly appearances. She even has some wasting over in her rump, and all of this hair on the ground was hers prior to this picture. And we struggled to try to keep weight on this mare given both of her endocrine diseases. So when we think about these two double whammies, so for the obese PPID horse, we want to try to reduce weight as much as possible. I really like ration balancers. I know I showed a picture previously of a horse responding to a ration balancer, but that was a full volume. If you cut it in half, they're going to be a little bit better. And make sure you feed it in 2 to 3 meals. We want a really low NSC forage. If you're trying to lose weight, I'd say, never go below the 1% of body weight. I typically don't go below 1.5% of body weight, just to make sure that their gut stays healthy. Again, you start implementing these nutritional strategies, the slow feeder for the ration balancer, the slow feeders and the hay balls, and they're not fun to stuff hay into, but they really do help. And of course, soaking your feeds, taking out as much sugar as possible, leaving that protein, leaving that the fat and some of that structural fiber there. And then for the lean PPID ID horse, we're really concerned about trying to put some more weight on these horses. Oftentimes you need to increase their body weight. Right now, our nutritional recommendations for these horses are using fats to try to help meet those higher energy requirements and put some weight on. I also really like unmolasses beet pulp, hay pellets, and hay cubes. I actually did a study where we looked at hay pellets and cubes, and we fed them in smaller meals and incorporated them into concentrate, and they didn't really increase the postprandial or the post-meal response. So right now we're thinking if you limit the amount and do small portions, that it should be okay. And then, of course, still remaining with the low NSC forage, and the other nutritional strategies that I mentioned previously. I know I tried to go through a lot, but if you guys have specific questions, you're always welcome to reach out. This is still a big growing field in terms of what we know, and still working on a lot. But thank you, Dr. Williams, for the invitation, and I'll happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Macon. That was fantastic. Let's go ahead and give her a wonderful virtual round of applause. We do have a lot of questions coming in. I want to get to some of them. Maybe won't get to all of them. I've already started on a few because I know I saw a lot coming in. But I'm going to ask Kyle. What he's going to do is add in the chat the link for our evaluation tonight. And I want to start doing that because I don't want to lose anybody without filling out the evaluation. This is how I know what you guys want to hear from year to year. Excuse me. And nutrition and how to feed EMS, horses, IR, etc. were probably the highest, most asked for topics. So I'd really love to hear about what you thought, but also about what you want to hear next year. So please go ahead and fill that out. But Dr. Macon, if you can take your slides down, we can go ahead and start diving into the questions. And actually, the first one, I'm going to kind of lump a couple questions together, and you might want to talk a little bit longer on them. But protein. So protein came up a lot. First was how soy has gotten a bad name, and soy is in everything. Is there anything you would recommend other than soy? And there's some other questions that ask about what do you recommend in terms of protein supplements. But I do also know you've done some work with high protein ration balancers and how that's not always good for some of these horses with the severe IR, et cetera. So can you kind of just address everything protein?
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny, this is the first thing brought up. I was talking with some people on Facebook about protein supplements and EMS the other day. Um, so the first set of work that really came that we really focused on was Dr. Caroline Luce, and she fed really high quality and quantity of protein and saw that insulin went through the roof. And this isn't surprising based off of the size of the meal and the amount and quality of the amino acids she was feeding, because we do know that insulin can actually be released and act on different amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. And I did do a lot of ration balancer work when I was in my PhD. And again, that one little graph where I had a big response and then I had a flat response, that was a ration balancer. And if you try to decrease the volume and how many times you feed them, or increase the times you feed them, but decrease the volume that they're getting in each meal, you can lower that insulin response. But yes, really high quality amino acids and different protein sources can certainly increase the insulin level. However, my work also showed that horses will respond more to the carbohydrates that are in that ration balancer than they will the actual protein in it. And then I think that was the first part. And then soy, we really there hasn't been much research in the different types of protein sources and if they're more, what we say, insulinogenic, or they actually make insulin be secreted more. I think that's going to be coming in the next few years as we start really focusing on the ingredients and all these different commercial grains to make sure that they're safe for these horses.
Great. Thank you very much for your answer there. So the next kind of handful of questions talks about the size of the meal. So you mentioned about trying to keep the size of the meal smaller. Can you explain kind of what you mean by smaller? And does that also include when you're feeding like pelleted forages, or does small meals only mean when you're talking about concentrates?
Yeah, no, when I say small meals, I'm referring to any type of concentrated pellet, because most of the time those pellets have been so processed that when the horse grinds them in their mouth and they go down into the digestive tract, those particular nutrients are really readily available for digestive enzymes to work on, and you get a lot of those nutrients absorbed in the small intestine, which gives us the biggest response and insulin. So when I say small meals, I'm talking about a ration balancer. I'm talking about a low NSC commercial grain. And the forage pellets that did the study on. We did all of those in very small meals where the feeding rate was roughly about the same as a ration balancer. And if you split that same meal size, so for a 1,200-pound horse, you're thinking a pound and a quarter, basically, depending upon the different mass of those different pellets, but keeping them pretty small. Or if you can't increase the number, maybe try to implement those other nutritional strategies so it takes them longer to eat those things. So that insulin after they eat, it goes up just a little bit, but it stays lower, rather than having this big peak and they eat it all in one go. I can see many metabolic horses doing that.
Great. Yeah, good answers. So I'm gonna actually put this in the chat as well because I have no idea how to pronounce it, but I've been getting more and more questions about this and I have not heard of it. It's actually a drug and we want to know your recommendation. What do you think of it? Do you know anything about it? And I'm really not even gonna try. It begins with an E.
Oh, your triglyceride. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this class of drugs was very highly debated at this year's American Association of Equine Practitioners conference. And these particular drugs are what we call an SGLT2 inhibitor. So an SGLT2 is a little receptor that helps move glucose and sodium around in the body. And this basically helps take that glucose that's in the blood and get it where it needs to go and decrease your blood glucose levels. Most of the work that's been presented, these have amazing results. One individual professor from Australia was presenting, and he showed a pony that was just crippled from laminitis, and then they started this pony on I think it was either dapagliflozin or urticagliflozin. I can't remember which one it was, but this horse, 2 weeks later, was running around in the field. These are some really promising drugs, and I think that this is probably going to be a first line for something that is currently undergoing laminitis, but we don't know the long-term effects of these drugs. We know vet says that they should stay on for long periods of time. We want to get them through their laminitis bout, get them to where they need to be, because these drugs can also have a really big effect on lipid levels in the blood and the liver function. So they're not meant to be chronic treatments. They're meant to help you through some of the harder parts of laminitis.
Great, thank you. So that was definitely a big answer to a lot of the questions I've been getting. We still have a lot of people hanging out, so I'm going to keep going with a few more questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but again, before you leave, please go ahead and fill out the evaluation. It's only about 4 or 5 questions, so it should be really quick. But you mentioned about seasonality and how season changes, the basis of the test. So we always make sure we try to, watch what season we're on. But what about just light levels in general? Like if horses are also brood mares and they're under, fake lighting schemes, does this also change, or is it just season?
No, so from some of the older research that was done, whenever you mix in gestation with insulin dysregulation, there seems to be a little bit of some discrepancy in horses, where horses that are gestating will actually have gestational, not diabetes, but gestational insulin resistance, where they just become less sensitive to insulin's actions. So if you're thinking about before that period, if they're going on lights and you're trying to get them to cycle, I don't believe anyone's actually ever looked at, if you put them under artificial lighting, if their insulin values will change. But I would suspect, because they are seasonal breeders, those hormones are responding to whatever the daylight, whether it's natural or artificial. I would suspect that there is an ability to probably manipulate those hormones, but I don't believe anyone's actually looked at it. But a lot of that seasonal change was from nutrients in grass in the spring that I saw, and also in the fall was getting prepared to go into winter. And when you think about horses going into winter, they start getting a little fluffier, because they're piling on some fat stores to try to make it through based off of what their brain tells them to do. And there's some insulinogenic or very active insulin secreting pathways that triggers.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to keep asking questions, but I am going to share, because it might be easier for people to do this. I'm going to share my screen actually and put up a QR code for the form, the Qualtrics form. So if you want to just do it on your phone while you're listening, you can also snapshot the QR code here. We actually just had a couple of questions come in about seizures. Are horses with IR prone to seizures if either undiagnosed or untreated for a long period of time?
I don't think there's been anything in the literature that has linked seizures and insulin dysregulation or resistance, but I'm curious if maybe what they're seeing is some type of glycogen storing problem, like PSSM or something like that that's undiagnosed, or there's a few more that have popped up here recently. I had another case, myosin heavy chain myopathy. Even if you have like just one copy of one of these diseases, then that it does have seizures, severe muscle wasting. And I don't think anyone's actually looked to see what their insulin and glucose metabolism is. It might be altered because of these other genetic diseases, but I haven't ever heard of a genetically healthy ID or IR horse having seizures.
Good, thank you. I think maybe two more quick ones. So this one, there's a new stall side insulin test. Do you recommend that? Is it valid?
Yeah, so there's two companies that make stall side insulin tests. I think these are great tools. Um, they they've roughly been validated with what the normal assay we do, which is called a radioimmunoassay. So we use radioisotopes to basically quantify how much insulin is in the blood. These little SNAP tests have been compared against those the standard radioimmunoassays. They perform pretty well. But what's going to be key is doing enough of those SNAP tests on your horse to kind of set up a standard. So when your horse does have really high insulins, that SNAP test can detect it. I think there has to be cutoffs for how high they can detect insulins. And it's probably going to go up to that laminitis threshold. But of course, these SNAP insulin tests, sometimes they malfunction. That's why I always say to just order a few of them and run the same one a couple of times to make sure you have the correct value.
Good, good. So I'm going to kind of combine a few here. So someone asked about dieting and how that affects crusty necks, or just strictly crusty necks and IR, but then also about your feelings with dieting and say alfalfa. I know you mentioned a little bit about alfalfa there. I'm kind of trying to combine two questions because I think we're going to wrap up with this here. So what are your thoughts there?
So based off of the research that's been done, crusty neck is probably one of the biggest positive associations with insulin dysregulation. The bigger the neck, the more likely they're going to be insulin dysregulated and the more severe. So when it comes to looking at a crusty neck and maybe dieting and hopefully trying to decrease that fat above that nuchal ligament, depending upon what type of fat it is, I've seen horses that we've tried to get weight off 6 ways to Sunday, and that crusty neck just stays there. And we don't know why it doesn't go away. But we do know that if it's softer fat, that most likely you can get some of that off. But when it comes out really hard, you can grab it and like twist it back and forth. I think it's there to stay. So it's really hard to get rid of that crusty neck fat. And then for alfalfa, as long as you're taking and soaking that and getting the excess sugar out of it, I really like it as an added protein and calorie source. If you have something that's lean and has ID and maybe even PPID, I'm actually about to do a study where I'm looking at incorporating pellets, cubes, and chop hay in a concentrate meal and see if I can even decrease the post meal response. And I think University of Kentucky is actually going to be putting out some grazing as well as long stem hay studies really soon. And I'm excited to see those because they also found that if you stay below the 0.1 grams of NSE per kilogram body weight, that their insulin responses were really low. So I'm glad that my number's holding up. But yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Macon. I think this was wonderful. I did just put in the chat in case you were on the conference last Tuesday and already filled out the evaluation. This is actually separate, so please fill it out again. You just don't need to give your recommendations for future talks. If you already did that once, that's fine. But we still want to hear what you thought of today's seminars. So again, overall, thank you. I know so much, Dr. Macon. I know Dr. Ivey had to log off and take care of her kids. So I know everybody has a very busy schedule. So I really, really appreciate all of your time. I appreciate everybody for joining us as well. And we hope to see you next week. And next week, we are going to hear two very different presentations, one on the senior horse and some demographics throughout the U.S. about senior horses. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Chris Heine, who we did hear from last year. She talked about evaluating pain in horses, but this time we're going to take it a step further and talk about evaluating pain while riding. So I know very popular topics of conversation there. So hope to see you all next week. Thank you again, Dr. Macon, for all of your time. And thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great night. Take care.
Thanks, Dr. Williams.
Bye now.